In the pouring rain, Daniel hurled his pregnant black wife's suitcase onto the wet pavement while his mistress smirked from the doorway. Ella didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply stood there, both hands resting on her swollen belly, watching them with an unsettling calm. When her mother-in-law crossed a line so unforgivable that even the cold rain seemed to gasp, Ella slowly wiped her face. Then she pulled out her phone and made one short call. Within minutes, the color drained from their faces. Who was this woman that a single phone call could turn their world upside down? 3 years ago, Ella had believed in love. She remembered the day Daniel first approached her at a coffee shop in downtown Manhattan. She had been reading a worn paperback, her natural hair pulled back in a simple bun, wearing a thrift store sweater that she genuinely loved. No makeup, no designer labels, nothing that would suggest she was anything other than an ordinary woman enjoying her afternoon. Daniel had smiled at her like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He didn't care that she was black. He didn't ask about her family's money or connections. He simply asked if he could buy her another cup of coffee. That was the man Ella had fallen in love with. That was the man she had married. But that man had slowly disappeared over the past 3 years, eroded by whispers and expectations and the relentless pressure of his mother's disappointment. Margaret had never approved of the marriage. From the moment Daniel brought Ella home, his mother had made her feelings painfully clear. She never used slurs, never said anything that could be quoted back as explicitly racist. She was far too clever for that. Instead, she wielded her disapproval like a surgeon's scalpel, cutting with precision. "She's very simple, isn't she?" Margaret would say, eyeing Ella's modest clothing. "I just worry she won't fit in with our circle." "Are you sure she's not after your money, sweetheart? You know how those people can be. I only want what's best for you, Daniel. A man in your position needs a wife who can elevate him, not drag him down." Day after day, month after month, year after year, those words had done their work. Daniel began to see Ella through his mother's eyes. He started coming home later. He stopped holding her hand in public. He flinched when colleagues asked about his wife. Ella watched it all happen with a quiet sorrow that she kept buried deep inside. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that love would be enough, that Daniel would choose her over his mother's approval, over society's expectations, over his own ambition. She had been wrong. What none of them knew, what Ella had carefully hidden for the entirety of their relationship, was the truth about who she really was. Ella was the only daughter of Richard Okonkwo, a Nigerian-American billionaire whose investment conglomerate controlled assets worth more than most people could comprehend. She had grown up in mansions, attended the finest schools, and had access to wealth that would make Margaret's aspirations look like pocket change. But Ella had seen too much. She had watched people transform the moment they learned her last name. Friends who suddenly wanted favors. Men who looked at her and saw dollar signs instead of a person. She had been betrayed so many times by those who claimed to love her that she had stopped believing genuine love was possible for someone like her. So she had made a deal with her father. 5 years of anonymity. 5 years to live as an ordinary woman, to find someone who would love her for herself and not for her inheritance. Her father had reluctantly agreed, though he insisted on keeping a protective eye on her from a distance. What Ella didn't know at first was that her father's protection extended further than she realized. When Daniel landed his dream job at a prestigious investment firm, he had no idea that the company was a subsidiary of her father's empire. When he was given a generous housing allowance that let them buy a beautiful home in an upscale neighborhood, he never questioned where that money really came from. Richard Okonkwo had been watching, waiting, giving his daughter's husband every opportunity to prove himself worthy. Daniel had failed spectacularly. The rain had started around 7 that evening, a cold autumn downpour that hammered against the windows like an accusation. Ella was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard the front door open and close, followed by voices. Multiple voices. She walked into the living room and felt her heart crack. Daniel stood there with his arm around a blonde woman Ella recognized from his office Christmas party. Victoria something. She was beautiful in that polished, expensive way that Margaret always praised, and she was looking at Ella with a smirk that made everything crystal clear. "Daniel," Ella said softly, her hand instinctively moving to her pregnant belly. "What's going on?" Her husband couldn't meet her eyes. "Ella, we need to talk." Margaret appeared from behind them, her face set in an expression of grim satisfaction. She had clearly been waiting for this moment. "There's nothing to talk about," Margaret announced, stepping forward. "My son has finally come to his senses. He's realized that this marriage was a mistake from the beginning." Ella looked at Daniel, searching for some trace of the man she had married. "Is that true?" He finally met her gaze, and what she saw there wasn't love or regret. It was relief. The relief of a man who had finally given himself permission to stop pretending. "I want a divorce," he said flatly. "Victoria and we've been together for 6 months now. I should have ended this a long time ago." 6 months. Ella did the math in her head. She had been pregnant for 7 months. He had started his affair when she was just weeks along with their child. "I see," she said quietly. Victoria laughed, a high, tinkling sound that grated against Ella's ears. "That's all you have to say? God, you really are as dull as Margaret said." "Pack your things," Daniel continued, growing bolder now that Ella wasn't making a scene. "I want you out tonight." "Tonight?" Ella looked at the rain streaming down the windows. "Daniel, I'm 7 months pregnant. At least let me—" "I don't care." His voice was cold. "I'll have your stuff sent to wherever you end up. Just go." Margaret stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with 3 years of suppressed contempt. "You heard my son. Get out. You never belonged here anyway. A woman like you thinking you could be part of our family? It was laughable from the start." Ella remained still. She had learned long ago that dignity was the one thing no one could take from you unless you let them. So she simply nodded and walked upstairs to gather her essentials. When she came back down with a single suitcase, Daniel grabbed it from her hands and marched to the front door. He opened it to the howling rain and threw her belongings onto the wet pavement. "There," he said. "Now get out." Ella stepped outside, the cold rain immediately soaking through her thin sweater. She walked to her suitcase and picked it up, then turned to face the 3 people watching from the doorway. It was at that moment that a delivery truck pulled up to a neighboring house. The driver, a young man named Clinton, stepped out with a package. He lived in Brooklyn but made deliveries across the city, and this upscale neighborhood was one of his regular routes. He had seen Ella before during his rounds. He had noticed how she always seemed a little sad, how her husband never held the door for her, how her mother-in-law looked at her with barely concealed disgust. Tonight, he saw something worse. He saw a pregnant woman standing alone in the rain while 3 people watched from a warm, dry doorway. He saw her suitcase on the wet ground. He saw the cruelty playing out in real time. Clinton grabbed an umbrella from his truck. He walked over to Ella and silently held it over her head. No words, just a simple act of human decency. Ella looked at him with surprise, then gratitude. She nodded her thanks. Margaret's voice cut through the rain. "Mind your own business, delivery boy." Clinton ignored her. He simply stood there, keeping Ella dry, his eyes fixed on the ground. But Margaret wasn't finished. 3 years of resentment had built up inside her, and now that her son had finally done what she always wanted, she felt invincible. She strode out into the rain, not caring that her expensive blouse was getting soaked. "You think you can just stand there looking pitiful and someone will save you?" Margaret hissed at Ella. "You're nothing. You've always been nothing. A poor black girl who got lucky enough to trap my son, and now your luck has run out." Ella said nothing. "That baby in your belly?" Margaret continued, pointing at Ella's stomach. "It will never be part of this family. I'll make sure of that. No grandchild of mine will have your blood." Still, Ella remained silent. Something about that silence infuriated Margaret beyond reason. She had expected crying, begging, pleading. She had expected Ella to fall apart. Instead, the younger woman just stood there with an expression that Margaret couldn't read. So Margaret did something unforgivable. She spat directly in Ella's face. The saliva ran down Ella's cheek, mixing with the rain. Clinton made a sound of disgust and stepped forward, but Ella gently touched his arm to stop him. Slowly, deliberately, Ella wiped her face with the back of her hand. Then she looked at Margaret with eyes that held no anger, no hurt, no fear. What Margaret saw in those eyes was something that made her take an involuntary step backward. It was pity. Ella reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She dialed a number she knew by heart and lifted it to her ear. "Father," she said calmly, "I have my answer now. Do what you need to do." She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Daniel laughed nervously from the doorway. "Who was that supposed to be? Your imaginary rich father?" "Ella, we all know your dad works at a factory somewhere." Victoria giggled. "Maybe she's calling her pimp." Margaret forced a smile, but something had shifted. Something about the way Ella was looking at them, the absolute certainty in her voice, sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the rain. "You're pathetic," Margaret said, but her voice wavered slightly. "Making empty threats won't change anything." Ella didn't respond. She simply stood there under Clinton's umbrella, one hand on her belly, waiting. She had waited 3 years for this moment. She could wait a few more minutes. The rain continued to fall, relentless and cold. 15 minutes had passed since Ella's phone call, and Daniel was growing impatient. "Are you just going to stand there all night?" he called from the doorway. "Your imaginary rescue isn't coming, Ella. Just accept it and leave." Victoria wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing herself against him. "Maybe we should call the police. She's technically trespassing now." Margaret nodded approvingly. "That's a wonderful idea. Let the authorities deal with her." Clinton still stood beside Ella, holding the umbrella steady. He glanced at her face, searching for signs of distress, but found none. She looked almost serene, like a woman who knew something the rest of them didn't. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "do you have somewhere to go? I can call someone for you." Ella shook her head gently. "Thank you, but that won't be necessary. They're almost here." Before Clinton could ask what she meant, a sound cut through the rain. It was distant at first, barely audible over the storm, but it grew steadily louder. The unmistakable purr of expensive engines, multiple vehicles approaching in formation. Daniel stepped out from under the doorway awning, squinting through the rain. What the hell? The first car that turned onto their quiet suburban street was a black Rolls-Royce Phantom, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin suns. Behind it came a silver Mercedes Maybach, followed by 2 black SUVs with tinted windows. The convoy moved with the precision of a military operation, pulling up to the curb in front of the house. Neighbors began appearing at their windows, drawn by the unusual sight of vehicles worth more than their homes parked on their ordinary street. Daniel's face went pale. "What is this?" The driver of the Rolls-Royce stepped out first, a large man in a dark suit who moved with the controlled efficiency of professional security. He walked around the car and opened the rear passenger door. The man who emerged was tall and powerfully built, with dark skin and silver-streaked hair that gave him an air of distinguished authority. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Daniel's annual bonus, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to command a room. Richard Okonkwo had arrived. He didn't spare a glance for Daniel or Margaret or Victoria. His eyes went straight to his daughter, standing in the rain with a stranger's umbrella over her head, her clothes soaked, her suitcase at her feet. Something flickered across Richard's face. It might have been grief. It might have been rage. Whatever it was, he controlled it instantly, his expression settling into a mask of cold composure. He walked directly to Ella, removing his suit jacket as he went. When he reached her, he draped the jacket over her shoulders with a tenderness that seemed at odds with his intimidating presence. "My dear," he said softly, cupping her face in his hands. "I'm so sorry I let this go on for so long." Ella leaned into her father's touch. "I needed to know for myself." Richard nodded, understanding everything she wasn't saying. Then he turned to face the three people frozen in the doorway. Daniel had gone white as a sheet. Margaret was gripping the doorframe like she might collapse without its support. Victoria had released her hold on Daniel and taken several steps backward, her survival instincts apparently sharper than her conscience. Richard studied them the way a scientist might study bacteria under a microscope. There was no anger in his expression, no heat. Just a cold, clinical assessment that somehow felt more terrifying than any display of temper. "Thank you," Richard said finally, his voice carrying easily despite the rain. "Thank you for showing me exactly what kind of man my daughter married." Daniel's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. I don't understand. Who are you?" It was Ella who answered. She stepped forward, out from under her father's protective shadow, and faced her husband directly. The rain had stopped mattering to her. Nothing mattered now except the truth. "Daniel," she said, her voice steady and clear, "do you know whose name is on the deed to this house?" He blinked, confused by the question. "Mine. It's in my name." "No." Ella shook her head slowly. "Check again. You'll find that the house belongs to Okonkwo Holdings. It always has. The housing allowance your company gave you? That was my father's money, funneled through a subsidiary so you would never know." Daniel's confusion was shifting into something closer to panic. "What are you talking about?" "Your company," Ella continued. "The prestigious investment firm where you've built your career. Did you ever wonder why they recruited you so aggressively? Why you were promoted so quickly?" She let the questions hang in the air for a moment. "It's because that firm is owned by my father's conglomerate. Every opportunity you've had for the past 3 years, every success you've celebrated, every bonus you've earned, it all came from him." The color had drained completely from Daniel's face. He looked like a man watching his entire reality crumble. "Even your car," Ella added quietly. "The one you told everyone was a performance reward. That was a gift from my father, given through the company, so you would think you had earned it." Margaret found her voice. "That's impossible. We would have known. Someone would have told us." Richard spoke for the first time since his initial statement. "Why would anyone tell you? You weren't important enough to know." The words landed like a physical blow. Margaret actually staggered backward. "I spent 3 years watching," Ella said. 3 years hoping that I was wrong about you, Daniel. Hoping that somewhere inside you were still the man who fell in love with me at that coffee shop." Her hand moved to her belly. "I wanted so badly for my child to have a father worth respecting." Daniel fell to his knees in the rain. The water soaked through his expensive trousers, but he didn't seem to notice. "Ella, please, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." "Would it have mattered?" she asked. "If you had known I was rich, would you have treated me differently?" "Yes, no, He was crying now, tears mixing with the rain on his face. "Ella, I love you. I've always loved you. It was my mother. She kept pushing and pushing. She made me think—" "I made you think what?" Margaret's voice cracked. She was looking at her son like she had never seen him before. "I only wanted what was best for this family. I wanted you to have a wife who could help you succeed." I built my father's empire from nothing, Richard said coldly. I came to this country with $200 in my pocket and turned it into more money than your family will see in 10 generations. And you thought my daughter wasn't good enough for your son? Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time in her life, she had nothing to say. Victoria had been slowly edging toward the end of the porch, clearly calculating her escape. Richard's security team noticed her movement, and two of them stepped forward to block her path. She froze. "Please," Daniel begged, crawling toward Ella on his knees. "Please, I'll do anything. I'll change. I'll be better. Just don't take everything away." Ella looked down at her husband, at the man she had loved and lost, at the father of her unborn child. Part of her wanted to destroy him completely. Part of her wanted to let her father unleash the full weight of his resources and connections to ensure that Daniel never recovered from this moment. But she thought of the baby growing inside her. She thought of the kind of mother she wanted to be, the kind of person she wanted to become. "Stand up," she said quietly. Daniel scrambled to his feet, hope flickering in his eyes. "I'm not going to destroy you," Ella said. "For the sake of my child, who shares your blood whether I like it or not, I'm going to show you more mercy than you deserve." She turned to look at her father, who gave her a small nod of understanding. This was her decision to make. "You will be terminated from your position at the company tomorrow morning," Ella announced. "You will receive no severance, no recommendation letter, nothing. But I won't have my father blacklist you from the industry. You'll have to rebuild your career on your own merits, whatever those might be." Daniel nodded frantically. "Thank you. Thank you so much." "I'm not finished." Ella's voice hardened. "You and your family have 7 days to vacate this house. Not 72 hours because, unlike you, I'm not cruel enough to throw someone out with nowhere to go. 7 days. After that, the locks will be changed and anything left inside will be donated to charity." Margaret let out a sound that might have been a sob. "Where are we supposed to go?" "That's not my concern," Ella replied. "You've spent 3 years telling me I don't belong in your family. Now you can find out what it feels like to have nowhere to belong." She turned back to Daniel. "I'll be filing for divorce. I don't want your money because you don't actually have any that didn't come from my father. I don't want child support because I don't want my daughter growing up thinking she owes you anything. You'll have visitation rights if you want them, but I won't force you to be involved. That choice is yours." "Daughter?" Daniel's voice was hollow. "We're having a daughter?" "Yes." Ella placed both hands on her belly. "She'll grow up knowing that her worth isn't determined by her skin color or her family's bank account. She'll grow up knowing that she deserves to be loved for who she is, not what she can provide. And she'll grow up knowing that her mother chose dignity over revenge." Victoria made another attempt to slip away. This time, Ella addressed her directly. "You can go," Ella said. "I have nothing to say to you. But I'd suggest running far and fast because I suspect Daniel isn't going to look quite so appealing by tomorrow morning." Victoria didn't need to be told twice. She pushed past Margaret and disappeared into the rain, her designer heels clicking rapidly against the wet pavement. Richard stepped forward and placed a hand on Ella's shoulder. "Are you ready to leave?" Ella took one last look at the house where she had spent 3 years pretending to be someone she wasn't. 3 years of enduring small cruelties and quiet humiliations. 3 years of hoping that love would conquer hate. It hadn't, but she had learned something far more valuable than any lesson love could teach. She had learned exactly who she was and exactly what she deserved. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." Clinton, who had been standing silently through the entire confrontation, still holding his umbrella, finally spoke. "Ma'am, I'm glad things worked out for you." Ella turned to him with a genuine smile, the first she had managed all evening. "Thank you for the umbrella, and for staying." Clinton shrugged, embarrassed. It wasn't right, what they were doing. Anyone would have helped. "No," Ella said softly. They wouldn't have. That's what makes you different. She handed him back the umbrella and walked toward her father's waiting car. Richard's security team collected her suitcase and opened the door of the Rolls-Royce for her. Before she got in, she looked back one final time. Daniel was still standing in the rain, his expensive clothes ruined, his face a mask of devastation. Margaret had collapsed onto the porch steps, weeping into her hands. The house that they had been so proud of loomed behind them, a monument to ambitions built on borrowed foundations. Ella felt many things in that moment. Grief for the love she had lost, relief that the pretense was finally over, a deep, bone-tired exhaustion from years of carrying a secret that had grown heavier with each passing day. But she didn't feel hatred. She didn't feel the satisfaction of revenge. She just felt ready to begin again. Ella climbed into the car, and her father slid in beside her. As the convoy pulled away from the curb, she watched through the tinted windows as Daniel sank to his knees in the rain, a broken man surrounded by the ruins of everything he thought he had built. She placed her hands on her belly and whispered to her unborn daughter, "We're going to be okay, little one. Mama's going to make sure of it." The Rolls-Royce turned the corner, and Ella didn't look back again. The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork and quiet grief. Ella chose to live in a modest apartment in Brooklyn, despite her father's protests. Richard had offered her a penthouse in Manhattan, a beach house in the Hamptons, anything she wanted. But Ella needed something different. She needed to heal in a space that felt like her own, not a reminder of the wealth and privilege that had complicated her entire life. The apartment was small but comfortable. One bedroom, a tiny kitchen, windows that looked out onto a quiet street lined with trees that were shedding the last of their autumn leaves. It was nothing like the house she had shared with Daniel, and that was exactly the point. The divorce was finalized quickly. Daniel hadn't contested anything, too broken and desperate to fight. He had used his 7 days to move back in with Margaret, the two of them crammed into her modest condo, their social circle having evaporated the moment word spread about Daniel's termination and the reasons behind it. As for his visitation rights, Ella heard nothing from him. Not a single call, not a single message asking about the baby. His silence told her everything she needed to know about the kind of father he would have been. Ella didn't follow any other news about them. She didn't want to know. Instead, she focused on preparing for her daughter's arrival. She painted the small second room a soft yellow, assembled a crib with her own hands, and spent hours reading books about motherhood. She wrote in a journal every night, pouring out the pain and anger and grief that she had kept locked inside for so long. Some days were harder than others. She would wake up reaching for someone who wasn't there, or catch herself wondering what Daniel was doing, or feel the sharp sting of betrayal all over again as if it had just happened. But each day, the pain grew a little duller, the wounds a little less raw. Her father visited every Sunday, bringing food and fussing over her health. He never said, "I told you so," never criticized her choices. He simply sat with her, listened when she needed to talk, and held her when she needed to cry. It was on a Tuesday morning, about 6 weeks after that rainy night, that Ella walked into a small coffee shop near her apartment and found a familiar face behind the counter. Clinton looked up from the espresso machine and blinked in surprise. "Ella?" She was equally startled. The last time she had seen him, he had been standing in the rain holding an umbrella over her head while her life fell apart around her. "Clinton," she said, "I didn't know you worked here." He smiled, a little embarrassed. "I quit the delivery job a few weeks back. The routes were all over the city and I needed something closer to home so I could focus on school." He gestured vaguely at the menu board. "This place is just a few blocks from my apartment, and I'm taking night classes for engineering." Ella found herself smiling back. "That's wonderful." There was an awkward moment where neither of them knew what to say. Then Clinton cleared his throat and asked, "So, what can I get you?" She ordered a decaf latte, and that was that. but she came back the next day, and the day after that. Somehow, without either of them planning it, their brief interactions at the coffee counter became the highlight of Ella's quiet routine. Clinton never asked about what had happened that night. He never brought up the convoy of luxury cars, or the billionaire father, or the dramatic confrontation in the rain. He simply treated her like any other customer, then like an acquaintance, then slowly, carefully, like a friend. They talked about books. Clinton was working his way through the classics, having never had the chance to read them growing up. Ella recommended her favorites and was delighted when he actually read them and came back with thoughtful opinions. They talked about his engineering studies. He was fascinated by bridges, by the way something so massive could be held together by invisible forces of tension and compression. Ella listened and asked questions, genuinely interested in a world she had never explored. They talked about everything except her past or her money. And somehow that made all the difference. Ella's daughter was born on a cold December morning, exactly 1 week before Christmas. She named her Hope because that was what the child represented. A new beginning, a chance to get things right. When Ella held her daughter for the first time, she wept, not from sadness, but from a joy so overwhelming that it felt like her heart might burst. This tiny, perfect person was hers to love and protect and guide. This was her second chance. 3 days later, she sent Clinton a text inviting him to visit. She wasn't sure why. They were friends, certainly, but not close friends. Not the kind of friends who visited each other in the hospital. But Clinton had been the only person that terrible night who had shown her kindness without knowing who she was. And somehow, that meant more to her than all the loyalty money could buy. He arrived with a gift wrapped in newspaper because he couldn't afford proper wrapping paper. Inside was a small wooden car, roughly carved but sanded smooth, clearly made by hand. "I know she's too young for toys," Clinton said, looking embarrassed. "But I figured by the time she's old enough to play with it, she might like having something her mom's friend made for her." Ella held the little car in her palm, feeling the love that had gone into every imperfect cut and curve. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. Clinton sat in the chair beside her bed, admiring the sleeping baby. "She looks like you. I hope she has my mother's strength," Ella said quietly, "and none of her father's weakness." It was the first time she had mentioned Daniel since they started talking. Clinton didn't push for more. He simply nodded and said, "She'll have whatever you teach her to have." Ella looked at this man who worked at a coffee shop and took night classes and carved wooden toys by hand. This man who had offered her an umbrella in the rain simply because it was the right thing to do. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. Clinton waited. "My father is Richard Okonkwo, the billionaire. That night you saw, with all the cars and the security, that was him coming to get me." She watched his face carefully. "I'm not the ordinary person you think I am." Clinton was quiet for a long moment, looking at her, then at the baby, then back at her. "I know," he finally said. Ella's eyes widened. "You know?" "I looked it up after that night. Hard not to be curious when a fleet of Rolls-Royces shows up in a neighborhood like that." He shrugged. "Didn't change anything for me. You're still the woman who said thank you for an umbrella like it was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for her." Ella felt tears prickling at her eyes. "And it doesn't matter? The money, the family, none of it?" Clinton leaned forward slightly. "Ella, I work at a coffee shop just to afford tuition. I live in a studio apartment the size of your bathroom. I've got nothing to offer someone like you except friendship and maybe a few more wooden toys." He smiled gently. "So no, it doesn't matter, because I'm not trying to get anything from you. I just like talking to you about books." Ella laughed through her tears. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years. They didn't become a couple that day. There was no dramatic kiss, no declaration of love. Clinton went back to his coffee shop and his night classes, and Ella went home with her daughter to begin the long, beautiful work of being a mother. But he visited every week, and she started stopping by the coffee shop again, Hope sleeping peacefully in her stroller. And slowly, without either of them rushing it, something began to grow between them. Something real. On New Year's Eve, Ella stood at her apartment window with Hope in her arms, looking out at the city lights. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago, hiding her identity, hoping to be loved for herself, terrified that she never would be. She thought about Daniel, wherever he was now, learning the hard way that the world didn't owe him anything. She thought about Margaret, whose desperate climb toward status had cost her everything that actually mattered. And she thought about Clinton, who had nothing to offer but kindness and had given her exactly what she needed. "You're going to grow up knowing something important," Ella whispered to her daughter. "Your worth isn't measured by the color of your skin or the size of your bank account. It's measured by how you treat people who can do nothing for you." Hope yawned and snuggled closer. Ella smiled and pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead. Outside, fireworks began to explode across the sky, welcoming a new year full of possibility. Ella watched them with dry eyes and a peaceful heart. She had found herself, and that was worth more than any fortune.